Get out! Victoria Romano's voice cut through the cold morning air like a blade. She pointed one perfectly manicured finger at the two elderly strangers standing at her gate. A hunched old man in a patched coat, a small woman shivering in worn shoes, and she said it again louder this time, so the guards would have no excuse to hesitate. I said, get them out of my sight. If you've ever wondered what kind of person someone truly is, don't watch them in a ballroom. Watch them at their gate. Welcome to our channel. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow along until the very end, because what happens in this family will surprise you in ways you never expected. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning. It all began. The sky over Manhattan was the color of old pewter, heavy, flat, and cold enough that your breath came out in white clouds that disappeared before you could finish exhaling. Antonio Romano pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. It wasn't his coat. Not really. It was something his wife Sophia had found at a thrift store on 9th Avenue 3 days earlier. A gray wool thing with a broken zipper and a patch on the left elbow that someone had sewn on crooked. It smelled faintly of someone else's life. Cigarettes, cheap soap, loneliness. Sophia walked beside him, her head bent slightly against the wind, her silver hair tucked under a faded blue scarf. She had traded her diamond earrings for plain plastic studs. She had left her cashmere coat at home. She had pulled on gloves that were thin enough that the cold came right through them. Neither of them complained, because they had chosen this. Every detail of their appearance had been deliberate. The worn shoes, the canvas bag that sagged because it held nothing valuable, the way Antonio let himself walk with a slight limp, something that was only half an act because his knee had been giving him trouble since the winter before. They looked by every measure like two elderly people who had fallen through the cracks of a city that moved too fast to catch them. And that was precisely the point. Antonio had been awake since 4 a.m. He'd sat in his kitchen back in their townhouse in Brooklyn, the real one, the one nobody associated with the Romano name, and he had drunk his coffee and stared at the photographs on the refrigerator door. Damien at 7 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera, like the world owed him nothing, and he expected nothing from it. Damien at 16, serious-faced and already taller than Antonio, standing beside him at Sophia's birthday dinner. Damien at 32, on the day of his wedding, in a suit that cost more than most people's cars with Victoria on his arm, and a smile that looked right, but somehow felt rehearsed. Antonio had looked at that last photograph for a long time. Then he had poured the rest of his coffee down the drain, gone upstairs to wake Sophia, and said, "Today is the day." They had argued about this for months, not loudly. Antonio and Sophia had never been people who shouted at each other. They had been married for 41 years, and in 41 years, they had learned that the things worth fighting about didn't need raised voices. They needed patience. They needed honesty. They needed the courage to say the uncomfortable thing, even when the comfortable silence was right there waiting. "You want to spy on your own son's wife," Sophia had said the first time Antonio brought up the idea. She hadn't said it with accusation, just with the clarity of a woman who wanted to name the thing for what it was. "I want to know who she is," Antonio said. "The real version, not the version she performs for us." Sophia had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "And if we find out she's exactly who she appears to be, then we go home," Antonio said. "And we never mention this to anyone. And if we find out she's not," Antonio had looked at his wife, then really looked at her, the way he had looked at her 41 years ago, across a kitchen table in a small apartment in Queens, and he had said, "Then our son deserves to know." That was the night Sophia had agreed. They had done their homework carefully. They knew which days Damien's security team rotated shifts. They knew that on Wednesday mornings, the head of household security, a man named Marcus, who had been with the Romano family for 6 years, and who knew Antonio and Sophia by sight, was replaced by a younger crew that had only been hired in the past 8 months. New guards. Guards who had never met Damien's parents. Guards who would see exactly what Antonio and Sophia wanted them to see, 2 tired old strangers with nowhere to go. The Romano estate sat on a private stretch of road in Westchester, a massive white stone property behind iron gates, surrounded by landscaped grounds that cost more per month to maintain than most people's annual salaries. The driveway alone was a quarter-mile long. Antonio and Sofia approached from the service road. They walked slowly, deliberately, letting the cameras see them from a distance first. "Don't look at the cameras," Antonio murmured. "I know," Sofia murmured back. "I'm not your first partner in crime, Antonio." He almost smiled. They reached the gate at 8:47 in the morning. One of the guards, a young man early 20s, broad-shouldered and expressionless, stepped toward the intercom the moment he spotted them. "This is private property," the guard said. His voice wasn't unkind, just flat, professional. "We know," Antonio said. He made his voice a little rougher, a little slower. "We're sorry. We don't mean any trouble. We've been walking since 6 and my wife's feet are giving her a lot of pain. We were wondering just some water if it's not too much trouble. Maybe somewhere she could sit for a few minutes." The guard looked at Sofia. Sofia let her face do the work. She was 68 years old, and she had spent a lifetime reading rooms. She stood quietly with the dignified stillness of someone who was exhausted but too proud to beg. Her thin gloves, her worn shoes, the scarf pulled close around her face. The guard pressed the intercom button. "Mrs. Romano, there are 2 elderly people at the gate. They're asking for water and a place to rest." A pause. Then Victoria's voice came through the speaker. Clear, sharp, immediate. "What?" "2 elderly people, ma'am. They say they've been walking since early morning." "Why are you calling me about this?" Victoria said. "We are not a shelter. Get them away from the gate, immediately." The guard hesitated. "Ma'am, they're just asking for—" "Did I stutter?" Victoria said. "Tell them to leave, and then you and I are going to have a conversation about why you felt it necessary to interrupt my morning with this." The intercom went silent. The guard turned back to Antonio and Sofia. He at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I can't let you in. You'll need to move along." Antonio looked at him for a moment. He said nothing. He simply nodded, took Sofia's arm gently, and began to walk away. That was the first test, and Victoria Romano had failed it in under 45 seconds. They didn't leave. They moved to a small concrete barrier about 30 meters from the gate, just far enough to be technically off the property, close enough that they could still be seen from the security cameras at the right angle. Sofia sat on this barrier carefully. Antonio stood beside her. "Well?" Sofia said quietly. "Well?" Antonio agreed. They waited. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The cold was real. That part wasn't an act. The wind cut along that stretch of road without mercy, and Sofia's thin gloves were doing almost nothing, and Antonio could feel the chill working its way through the worn coat and settling into his shoulders. He was watching the gate. And then he saw her. A young woman came out of the side entrance of the main house. Not the grand front doors, but the smaller door that led from the kitchen wing. She was maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair pulled back and wearing a gray uniform that identified her as household staff. She carried a tray. On the tray was a thermos, 2 mugs, and what looked like a small plate of food wrapped in foil. She walked directly toward them. No hesitation. Antonio watched her approach with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades reading people and situations for survival. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look like she was performing an act of charity for an audience. She looked like she had seen 2 people who were cold and had gone to get them something warm. As if that were simply the obvious thing to do. "Excuse me," she said when she reached them. Her voice was warm and direct. "I saw you from the kitchen window. I'm sorry about what happened at the gate. Please, I brought you some coffee. And there's some bread and cheese here if you're hungry." She set the tray on the barrier beside Sofia. Sofia looked at the young woman with the expression she had worn when she held Damien for the first time, quiet, careful, already in the process of deciding something important. "That's very kind of you," Sofia said. "You didn't have to do that." "It's cold out here," the young woman said simply. "Of course I did." She paused, then added, "My name is Isabella. I'm one of the housekeepers here." "I'm Rosa." Sofia said her chosen name for the day. This is my husband Ernesto. Isabella looked at Antonio. How long have you been out here? About half an hour, Antonio said. Something moved across Isabella's face. Not pity, something harder and cleaner than pity. Quiet anger may be directed at no one in the immediate vicinity, but at something larger. At least sit here and warm up, she said. Is there somewhere you're trying to get to, family you're trying to reach? Our son, Antonio said. He lives nearby, but we couldn't reach him this morning. Isabella nodded. Here. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her own phone. Do you want to try calling him again? It was that detail of the phone that broke something open in Antonio's chest. The woman offered her own phone to two strangers at a gate. Not the house phone routed through security. Not a suggested alternative. Her own personal phone, unlocked, extended toward them in the cold. Antonio had to look away for a moment. He looked toward the iron gates of his son's house, and he thought about what it meant that a housekeeper had more grace in that single gesture than the woman who ran the household had shown in the entirety of her response. We're all right, he said. Thank you. We'll reach him soon. Isabella didn't rush away. She poured the coffee herself, handed Sophia a mug, handed Antonio one, and stood with them for a moment in the cold, as if she had all the time in the world, and two strangers standing at a gate were exactly the right place to be. Do you need anything else? She asked. You've already done more than most, Sophia said, and the warmth in her voice was entirely real. Isabella smiled a quiet, unguarded smile and said, It's nothing. Please take your time. Then she went back inside. Antonio and Sophia sat with their coffee for a long time after that. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said exactly. They had come here looking for something. They had found two things instead. One thing they had feared finding. One thing they had not expected at all. After a while, Sophia said, She didn't know who we were. No, Antonio said. She would have done the same thing for anyone. Yes. Sophia wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked at the gate. She looked at the stone house beyond it, partially visible through the bare winter trees. Our son lives there, she said quietly. He does. And that young woman, she worked inside that house. Sophia paused. And she is kinder than everyone living inside it put together. Antonio was quiet for a moment. Then he said, We need to find out more about her. Yes, Sophia agreed. We do. They came back the next morning. Different clothes, same basic, disguise aged, worn, unremarkable. They arrived earlier this time, just after 8, when the household was shifting from nighttime quiet to daytime activity. They took the same position near the concrete barrier. This time, the guard at the gate didn't even bother with the intercom. He simply shook his head at them from a distance, a single firm gesture, and looked away. They sat. 22 minutes later, Isabella came out of the kitchen entrance again. This time she was carrying a paper bag. When she reached them, she said simply, I thought you might come back. I packed some things from breakfast. Antonio looked at her steadily. You were expecting us. I was hoping you'd found your son, she said, but I thought just in case. She offered the bag to Sophia. There's oatmeal in the thermos, and a couple of oranges. Sophia took the bag. Isabella, she said, can I ask you something? Of course. Does Mrs. Romano know you're doing this? A very brief pause. Not guilty, just honest. No, Isabella said. She would prefer that I didn't. And that doesn't concern you. Isabella seemed to consider the question seriously, the way someone does when they want to give a real answer instead of a convenient one. It concerns me, she said. I like my job. I need my job. She paused. But those things don't change what's right. Sophia reached out and touched the young woman's hand. Just briefly, just once. Thank you, she said. And Isabella, who did not know she was speaking to the mother of the most powerful man in New York, looked at this worn, cold, tired-seeming woman and said, Don't thank me. Just come back inside with me and get warm. That was the moment everything changed. Not the moment. Antonio decided something needed to be done. He had already decided that sitting in the cold the day before, watching Victoria's voice come through the intercom like a door slamming shut. But the moment Sophia looked at her husband over Isabella's shoulder, her eyes clear and certain, and gave him the smallest, most definitive nod. They had found what they were looking for. They had found something they hadn't expected to find. They went inside. Isabella led them through the kitchen entrance, the staff entrance, the invisible door through which the unseen work of a household flowed in and out, and into a warm room that smelled of coffee and something baking, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been working since early morning. The kitchen staff glanced at them. Nobody objected. If Isabella was bringing in two elderly strangers, apparently that was Isabella's business, and the kitchen staff had learned to let Isabella's business be Isabella's business. She settled them at a small table in the corner, a staff table, plain wood, slightly scarred from years of use, and she brought them warm oatmeal and fresh orange juice and more coffee. And then something extraordinary happened. Victoria Romano walked into the kitchen. Not to see them. Victoria Romano did not typically inspect her own kitchen. She came in because she had a specific complaint about the timing of her morning juice, which had apparently arrived to her sitting room 3 minutes later than she expected. She stopped when she saw the two strangers at the table. Her expression went through 3 stages in under 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition that they were the same people from the gate, and then cold, unmistakable fury. She looked at Isabella. "Explain this," she said. Her voice was very quiet. That particular kind of quiet that isn't calm. That is the compression before force. Isabella stood up straight. "They were outside in the cold, Mrs. Romano. I brought them in for a few minutes to warm up. After I gave explicit instructions, you asked the guards to move them away from the gate," Isabella said. Steady, clear, unflinching. "They moved away from the gate. They were on the public road. Don't play word games with me." Victoria's voice had not risen, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You brought strangers into this house, into my kitchen, without my permission." "I brought 2 elderly people out of the cold," Isabella said. "Ma'am." That last word not insolent, but absolutely precise. Victoria looked at Antonio and Sophia. They did what they had agreed to do. If this moment arrived, they sat quietly, looking slightly frightened, slightly confused, the way elderly strangers caught in the middle of a power dispute might look. Except Antonio was watching Victoria Romano's eyes, with the attention of a man who had built a lifetime of judgment on exactly these small reveals. What he saw there, not concern. Not even anger at a policy violation. Pure, undiluted contempt. Not for a security breach. For them. For who she believed them to be. For their worn coats, and their plastic bag, and their presence in a kitchen that her money paid for. Victoria turned back to Isabella. "You are dismissed from the main house for the remainder of the week," she said. "You will work the guest quarters. And when these people have finished, you will personally escort them out the service entrance." She did not look at Antonio and Sophia again. She walked out of the kitchen. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Isabella turned back to them, and the steadiness of her expression, the refusal to let Victoria's contempt touch the dignity of what she'd done, was something Antonio knew he would not forget for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry about that," Isabella said quietly. "You take as much time as you need." Antonio Romano had been in organized crime for 30 years. He had sat across tables from men who would have killed him without a second thought. He had negotiated in rooms where the air itself felt pressurized with threat. He had made decisions that changed the course of businesses, families, and lives. And in all that time, in all those rooms, he could count on one hand the number of people he had met with the particular quality he saw in Isabella Cruz at that kitchen table. The quality of someone who knew what was right and did it anyway, without drama, without calculation, without checking first to see who was watching. It was the rarest thing in the world. And it was working inside his son's house quietly and invisibly, while his son's wife moved through the same rooms like a beautiful, costly piece of architecture that had never once been warm. Sophia waited until they were back in the car, their real car, a quiet black sedan parked on the service road 3 blocks away before she spoke. "He doesn't know," she said. "No. Antonio said. He doesn't. Do you think he suspects? Antonio thought about his son, the serious face in the photographs, the careful, controlled way Damien had always moved through the world, reading threats the way other men read menus. The way he had built his empire methodically, intelligently, with that particular Romano capacity for seeing past the surface of things. He's very good at reading power dynamics, Antonio said. He's less practiced at reading kindness. You can't develop an eye for something you haven't had to navigate. Sophia was quiet for a moment. He married her, she said, not as an accusation, just as a fact that had to be named. He married what she represented, Antonio said. The Morelli connection, the political relationships, the social network. He made a business decision and wrapped it in the language of a marriage. And now he's living with the consequences. Yes. Sophia looked out the window. That young woman, she said. Isabella. Yes. She's been inside that house how long? 4 months based on what the guards mentioned when we were at the gate the first day, Antonio said. She was hired in October. 4 months, Sophia said. And Damien hasn't noticed her. Damien has a lot on his mind. That's not an excuse. No, Antonio agreed. It's not. They were careful. They did not come back a third time in disguise. They didn't need to. Antonio had what he needed. Sophia had what she needed. And what they had was not a story, it was a pattern documented in their own direct observation, requiring nothing but the courage to tell it. Antonio called his son. I need to see you, he said. I'm busy, Pop, Damien said. He always said that. Antonio had learned decades ago not to take it personally. This isn't social, Antonio said. Come to Brooklyn, Sunday morning. A pause. Is everything okay? Come Sunday, Antonio said. We'll talk. He didn't sleep well on Saturday night, not because he was afraid of Damien's reaction, not exactly. He had been navigating Damien's reactions since the boy was 4 years old, and had the kind of temper that needed steady handling. Antonio knew his son. What kept him awake was something more complicated. The knowledge that what he was about to do would change his son's life, and the deeper knowledge, the one that sat beneath strategy and planning and rational thought, that what Isabella Cruz had done at that gate had already changed something. Not just in Damien's life, in Antonio's understanding of what his son's life had actually become. A man could build an empire, Antonio thought in the dark of his bedroom, while Sophia breathed quietly beside him. A man could build walls and gates and security systems and an organization of thousands, and still end up cold. Still end up in all the ways that mattered, standing outside his own life. Waiting for someone to open the door. Sunday morning. Damien arrived at 9:15, which was early for him and meant he was curious despite his careful neutrality on the phone. He came alone, no driver, no security, which told Antonio that whatever Damien expected from this conversation, he wanted it private. He sat across the kitchen table from his parents. He looked at his father. He looked at his mother. He read the room the way he always did, quick, comprehensive, slightly cautious. You're both okay, he said. It wasn't a question. We're fine, Antonio said. Then what is it? Antonio looked at his wife. She gave him the same nod she had given him in the cold outside the gate. Quiet. Certain. He turned back to his son. Damien, he said. Your mother and I went to your house last week. Damien's expression didn't change. I know. Sophia mentioned she wanted to. We went in disguise, Antonio said. Silence. Damien set down his coffee cup very carefully. Say that again. We dressed as beggars. We went to your gate. We wanted to see. Antonio paused, choosing the next words the way you choose footholds on a difficult climb. We wanted to see who Victoria is when nobody important is watching. The silence this time had a different quality. It was the silence of a man who was extremely intelligent, extremely controlled, and extremely aware that what he was about to hear was going to cost him something. And, Damien said. Antonio told him everything. He told him about the intercom, Victoria's voice. We are not a shelter. The guard's face when he turned them away. He told him about Isabella coming out of the kitchen entrance with a thermos. He told him about the phone offered without hesitation to two strangers. He told him about the second day and the paper bag. And it concerns me, but those things don't change what's right. He told him about Victoria walking into the kitchen. He told him about that particular unmistakable contempt. He told him about Isabella standing steady. He told him everything. Damien listened without interrupting. His face throughout was absolutely still. When Antonio finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Then Damien said, "You came to my house in disguise." "Yes. To test my wife." "To know her," Antonio said. "Not to test her, to know her. There's a difference." Damien stood up from the table. He walked to the kitchen window and stood there for a moment with his back to them. The same way he had stood at windows his whole life, when he needed to think, when he was 7 years old, when he was 16, when he was the most powerful man in New York. Always the window. Always the same need for a moment of stillness before the next move. When he turned around, his voice was very controlled. "Isabella Cruz," he said. "Yes." "She's been working in the house for 4 months." "Yes." Damien looked at his father, then at his mother, then somewhere past them both at something none of them could see. He said, "I'm going to pull the security footage." "I know," Antonio said. "And if it shows what you're telling me." "It will," Sophia said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken in a long time. Damien looked at her. She looked back at him with the steady, patient, absolute certainty of a woman who had known him his whole life, and who had never in all that time told him something that wasn't true. He picked up his keys. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out of the kitchen, and a moment later they heard the front door close. Antonio sat back in his chair. Sophia reached across the table and took his hand. "He'll find it," she said. "Yes," Antonio said. "He will." And then everything changes. Antonio looked at their joined hands, her thin gold wedding ring, his broader one, 41 years, of the same metal worn smooth. "Everything already changed," he said. "The moment that girl walked out of the kitchen with a thermos." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think he'll see it? Not just what Victoria did, but what Isabella is." Antonio thought about his son, the man who had built everything on intelligence and strategy and the ability to read power. The man who had perhaps forgotten how to read something simpler, something truer. "He'll see it," Antonio said. "How do you know?" Antonio Romano thought about a girl who had offered a stranger her own phone in the cold. He thought about a man who had built a billion-dollar empire and still somehow ended up standing outside his own heart. He thought about windows, about doors, about which ones you choose to open. Because, he said, he's still our son. And in the kitchen of a small house in Brooklyn, the first quiet tremor of something enormous moved through the foundations of a family and the empire built above it. And nothing from that morning forward would ever be quite the same. Damien Romano drove back to Westchester alone. No music, no calls, no radio. Just the road and the thing his father had told him, sitting heavy in his chest like something swallowed wrong. He had spent the entire drive telling himself there was a reasonable explanation. That his parents were older now, perhaps more sensitive. Perhaps reading too much into a single interaction with a woman who was simply maintaining a household the way she had always maintained it. Victoria was not warm by nature. He knew that, had always known it, but there was a difference between being cold and being what his father had described. He almost believed it. Almost. But Antonio Romano was not a man who exaggerated. He was not a man who dramatized. He was not a man who had ever in the 68 years of his life walked into a room and manufactured a crisis where none existed. So Damien drove in silence, and he let the thing sit in his chest, and he did not try to dissolve it with logic before he had seen what he needed to see. He pulled through the gate at 10:40 in the morning. Marcus was on shift. Marcus, who had been with the family 6 years, who had been a guard at the outer perimeter the day of the wedding, who knew every vehicle and every face connected to the Romano household. He opened the gate without being asked and gave Damien a single nod as the car passed through. Damien didn't stop to speak to him. He went directly to the security office. The security office was a room off the east corridor of the main house, small, climate-controlled, lined with monitors, staffed during the day by a rotation of 2 men. When Damien walked in, both of them stood immediately. "Out," Damien said. They left without a word. He sat down in front of the central console and pulled up the archive system. He knew exactly how to navigate it. He had designed the security infrastructure himself 3 years ago when they moved in. Every camera, every angle, every timestamp. He typed in the date his father had told him. Wednesday, 8:47 in the morning, and he began to watch. The footage from the front gate camera was high definition and time-stamped down to the second. Damien watched his parents, and it took him a full 30 seconds to recognize them, which told him everything he needed to know about how carefully they had done this approach the gate in their worn coats. He watched the guard at the intercom. He watched the guard press the button and speak. And then he listened. He listened to his wife's voice come through the speaker. "We are not a shelter. Get them away from the gate, immediately." He listened to it twice. The second time, he sat very still, his hands flat on the desk, and he made himself hear it, not as his father's account of what had happened, but as the direct, unedited, time-stamped record of his wife's voice speaking those words in that order, with that particular species of impatience. "We are not a shelter." He switched cameras. He found the angle that covered the stretch of service road beyond the gate. He watched his parents sit on the concrete barrier in the cold. He checked the timestamp. 23 minutes they sat there. He switched cameras again. He found the kitchen wing exterior camera, and he advanced the timestamp, and he watched the side door open. He watched Isabella Cruz come out carrying a tray. He watched her walk directly toward the 2 strangers without hesitation, without looking back at the house to see if anyone was watching, without any of the performance of a person doing a good thing for an audience. Just straight, direct, purposeful. He watched her pour the coffee herself. He watched his mother take the mug. He watched Isabella pull out her phone. He leaned forward in his chair. He switched to the kitchen interior camera, and he found the next morning's footage, and he watched the full sequence of Victoria walking in and finding them at the table. He watched Isabella stand up straight. He listened the interior cameras had audio, and he heard his wife say in that same quiet and somehow far more dangerous voice, "After I gave explicit instructions." He heard Isabella say, "You asked the guards to move them away from the gate. They moved away from the gate." He heard Victoria say, "You are dismissed from the main house for the remainder of the week." He heard Isabella say, "I'm sorry about that. You take as much time as you need." He sat in that room for a long time after the footage ended. He sat there long enough that one of the guards knocked on the door, and then thought better of it and walked away. He sat there, and he thought about a word his father had used that morning at the kitchen table in Brooklyn. No, not test. No. There was a difference, his father had said. Damien was beginning to understand what that difference felt like from the inside. Because watching the footage wasn't like hearing a story. Hearing a story, you could argue with the interpretation. You could say, perhaps the tone was different. Perhaps there was context. Perhaps the person telling the story missed a nuance. The footage didn't have a perspective. The footage just had Victoria's voice saying, "We are not a shelter," and Isabella's hands wrapping around a thermos in the cold, and his mother's face, which he recognized even through the disguise. Once he knew to look, receiving that small act of warmth, like it was the most valuable thing anyone had offered her in years. He stood up. He walked out of the security office, and he went looking for his wife. He found her in the sitting room on the second floor, the room she used for her personal correspondence and what she called her social management. A phrase that had always struck Damien as slightly clinical, but which he had never examined closely enough to understand why. She looked up when he entered. She read his face immediately. Victoria had always been quick at reading faces. It was one of the things that had made her effective in the social landscape she moved through, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly, more like readiness. The particular readiness of someone who has been waiting without knowing they were waiting for a confrontation they knew was coming. "You spoke to your parents," she said. "I pulled the security footage," Damien said. A pause. Damien, I want to hear you explain it, he said. Not defend it, explain it. Two elderly people at the gate asking for water and a place to sit down for a few minutes, and your response was, "We are not a shelter." Victoria set down her pen. She composed herself with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been trained since childhood to hold herself together in difficult rooms. I run this household, she said. We cannot open this gate to every person who approaches it. Do you understand the security implications? Don't, Damien said. One word, flat and complete. Victoria stopped. Don't make this about security, he said. I designed the security system in this house. I know what it can and cannot handle. Two elderly strangers asking for water is not a security event. Try again. The silence between them was a specific kind of silence. The kind that Damien recognized from years of negotiation tables, the silence of a person recalculating, deciding which version of the truth to offer. They had no business being at our gate, Victoria said. Her voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an edge now that she usually kept out of conversations with him. This is a private estate. We are not equipped to function as a charity service. If I allowed every person who approached this property... It was two people, Damien said. One morning, in the cold. That is not the point. Then tell me what the point is. Victoria looked at him directly. And for a moment, just a moment, the social surface slipped, and he saw something underneath it that he had not quite seen clearly before, or perhaps had seen and chosen not to examine. She said, the point is that appearances matter. The point is that our position requires us to maintain certain standards. The point is that allowing indigent strangers into our home is not... My parents, Damien said. The room went very quiet. Victoria blinked. What? They were my parents, Damien said. The two elderly people at the gate, Antonio and Sofia Romano, dressed in thrift store clothes, testing you. The color in Victoria's face changed. Not a flush, more like a tide going out, a sudden draining that left her expression exposed and raw, and entirely without the elegant architecture it normally inhabited. That's, she started. I watched the footage, Damien said. I heard your voice. I watched what Isabella did. And then I sat in that room for a while and thought about the fact that I have been married to you for 3 years, and I didn't know, genuinely didn't know until this morning, which one of you was the person I wanted in my house. That is not fair, Victoria said. Her voice had developed a quality it very rarely had, something close to genuine agitation. I didn't know who they were. That's the point, Damien said quietly. That's exactly the point, Victoria. He left the room. He didn't slam the door. He closed it with the quiet precision of a man who has made a decision and no longer needs emphasis. He walked down the corridor and down the stairs, and he found himself in the kitchen, which was quiet at this hour, the staff having cleared after the late morning service. And then he heard her. Isabella Cruz was in the back part of the kitchen, the prep area, and she was having a conversation with someone on her phone, not loudly, not carelessly, but not quite quietly enough to be completely private. He caught 3 words before he would have announced himself. 3 words that stopped him completely. My brother needs... A pause. I know it's a lot. I'm working on it. Another pause, longer this time. I'll figure it out. Just tell him to hang on. I'm going to get there. Then she ended the call, and before Damien could decide whether to announce himself or retreat, she turned and saw him standing in the doorway. The surprise registered on her face for exactly 1 second. Then she straightened. Mr. Romano, she said. I'm sorry, I was just finishing up. I didn't realize you were... Don't apologize, Damien said. She stopped. He looked at her for a moment. He realized, genuinely not looked at her before. She had existed in his peripheral vision for 4 months as part of the household infrastructure, the way the kitchen itself existed, or the temperature of the room's present functional, noticed only when something went wrong. He was looking now. My parents, he said. The 2 people at the gate last week. He watched the understanding move through her face. He watched her go still in the way. People go still when the floor has just shifted beneath them, and they are not sure yet whether it will hold. Oh, she said. It was a very small word for a very large moment. "They told me what you did," Damien said. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then, "I just brought them some food." "You offered them your phone." "They said their son wasn't answering." She paused. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know." "Mr. Romano, You got demoted," Damien said, "to guest quarters, for the week." "It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal," he said. "It's a significant big deal, and you know it is." Something in Isabella's composure shifted. Not broke, but shifted. Like the difference between a wall and a door. Still solid, but with the possibility of opening. "I thought they needed help," she said. "It didn't feel like a complicated decision." "Most of the right ones don't," Damien said. "That's how you know they're right." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "The guest quarters assignment is reversed. You're back in the main house." He walked out of the kitchen, and behind him, Isabella Cruz stood in the quiet of the prep area and looked at the phone in her hand and thought very carefully about what had just happened and what it might mean and whether she was prepared for any of it. She was not sure she was. But then she had learned long ago that you rarely were. You simply did the next right thing, and you trusted that the right things added up to something you could live with. She put her phone in her pocket. She went back to work. The day continued, and 3 floors above her in a sitting room with expensive furniture and a view of manicured grounds. Victoria Romano sat very still with a pen in her hand and stared at a blank piece of paper, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage began to do the calculation she should have done at the beginning. The calculation of what she stood to lose. The number was very large, and for the first time in her life, it frightened her. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not called in months. Her brother answered on the second ring. "I need to talk to you," she said. "About what?" "About Damien," she said. "And about what we do if things go wrong." The pause on the other end of the line was precise and deliberate, the pause of a man who had been waiting for this call and had prepared his response in advance. "Nothing is going to go wrong," he said. "But come to dinner Thursday. We'll talk." Victoria hung up. She set the phone face down on the desk. She did not pick up the pen again. She sat there for a long time looking at the blank paper, and for a moment, just a moment, because she was not the kind of woman who allowed these moments to last. She felt something that she might have named regret if she had been practiced enough at honesty to know what regret actually felt like. The moment passed. She picked up the phone and called her assistant and began managing the day. Meanwhile, across the house in the corridor outside the guest suites, a housekeeper named Isabella Cruz pushed a cart quietly along the hall and thought about a phone call she needed to make, and a problem that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with the reason she needed this job more than most people would ever understand. Her brother. Marco Cruz was 24 years old, and he was in trouble. Not the casual kind of trouble that young men with better options might stumble into and stumble out of again. The kind of trouble with weight to it. The kind that accumulates when the options run out, and the next step looks from the outside like a cliff, but from the inside looks like the only road left. He had been working a construction job in Baltimore that had dissolved overnight when the company lost its contract and its backers in the same week. He had sent money home to their mother in Providence for 3 months after that, drawing down savings that weren't deep enough to draw from. And then the savings were gone, and the next job fell through, and Marco had called Isabella 3 weeks ago with the careful, controlled voice of a proud young man who was running out of ways to be proud. "I need help," he had said. 3 words. She knew what they cost him. How much, she had asked. He had told her. It was more than she had. She was close. She had been saving aggressively since she got the Romano job, which paid better than anything she had found in the 2 years since she'd moved to New York from Chicago. She had another 4 months of saving at the current rate before she would have what Marco needed. But Marco didn't have 4 months. Marco had 3 weeks. She had been trying to figure out the gap every day since then, running the numbers in her head during the quiet parts of the work. The corridor, cleaning the linen changes, the early morning kitchen prep, trying to find the calculation that closed the distance between what she had and what he needed. She hadn't found it yet. But she was still looking. Because that was what she did. She pushed the cart to the end of the corridor, turned it around, and began heading back. She passed the door to the main sitting room on the second floor, Victoria's room, and she heard through the door the crisp and efficient sound of Victoria Romano on a phone call, and she caught 3 words clearly through the not-quite-closed door. Keep him busy. She didn't slow down. She kept walking, kept her face neutral, filed the words in the back of her mind in the category of things she had heard in this house that were none of her business and needed to stay that way. She had learned early in her life in service that you heard things. You heard everything eventually if you moved quietly enough and worked consistently enough and kept your attention on your work rather than the drama in the rooms around you. And the only way to stay safe in a house like this one, the only way to stay employed, to stay useful, to stay on the right side of the invisible lines, was to be very disciplined about what you allowed yourself to do with what you heard. She let it go. She kept walking. She kept working. And the day continued its course, and the house moved through it, the way houses do. Surfaces maintained, performances, continued the machinery of wealth and reputation, turning and turning and turning, beneath a calm exterior that showed nothing of the fault lines running through its foundations. But fault lines don't stay hidden forever. They move. They grow. And one morning, not that morning, but soon, the ground would shift in a way that even the most carefully managed surfaces could not conceal. Damian Romano knew something he hadn't known the day before, and knowing it had changed his relationship to every room in his own house. He walked through those rooms differently now. He noticed things he had not allowed himself to notice. The way Victoria spoke to the staff, not with warmth, not even with neutrality, but with the precise minimum of acknowledgement required to move them through a task and out of her sight. The way she used names when it was efficient to do so and didn't use them when it wasn't. The way she thanked people in the same tone she used to order them. He noticed the way Isabella moved quiet, but not invisible, efficient, but not mechanical. He noticed that the kitchen staff spoke differently when she was present, more easily, more like people. He noticed that he had been in this house for 3 years, and he had somehow managed to miss this distinction entirely. And that bothered him in a way that went past guilt and into something harder. Because Damian Romano prided himself truly deeply. Prided himself on seeing clearly. On seeing past the performance to the structure underneath. It was the skill that had built everything he had. The ability to walk into a room and read every person in it before any of them had finished their opening sentence. He had walked into his own home for 3 years and read it wrong. He had looked at Victoria and seen what she wanted him to see. He had not seen Isabella at all. That was the thing that kept moving through him now, beneath the surface of everything. Not just the anger at what Victoria had done, but the deeper, harder reckoning with what it meant about himself. That he had built a world full of people who performed for him, and he had gotten very good at evaluating the performances. And somewhere along the way, he had lost the ability to recognize the people who weren't performing at all. I was thinking about this sitting in his home office, the city visible through the glass, the security feed playing silently on one monitor when his phone rang. It was Marcus. Mr. Romano, there's a situation developing with the Petrov account. Vitaly is asking for a meeting. Damian straightened. Business. The kind that required his full attention and left no room for the other conversation happening in the back of his mind. When? He said. He wants Thursday. Tell him Friday. My office, not his. Yes, sir. And Marcus. Sir. The housekeeper, Isabella Cruz. She was reassigned to guest quarters earlier this week. A pause. Yes, sir. Reverse it. She's back in her full assignment, effective immediately. A longer pause. Marcus was too professional to ask why, but the pause was there anyway. Understood, he said. Damian hung up. He went back to the security feed. He watched without quite knowing he was doing it. The kitchen corridor camera. Watched the ordinary movement of an ordinary afternoon in a house that had been until 48 hours ago. Something he thought he understood. He saw Isabella come around the corner with her cart. He watched her pause outside a door, listened briefly without obviously listening, and then continue walking. He watched the particular quality of her stillness in that pause. The discipline in it. The intelligence. He thought about what he had heard on the phone in the kitchen. My brother needs. He thought about the fact that she had given his parents her personal phone. He thought about the fact that she had taken the demotion to the guest quarters without complaint or appeal. He thought about the fact that she had said to his parents, "It concerns me, but those things don't change what's right." He was not a sentimental man. He had not survived 30 years in this business by being sentimental. But he was by necessity and nature a man who understood value. And he was beginning to understand that he had been very careless with something very valuable. He put the security feed on standby. He pulled out his phone and he called his attorney. "I need to talk to you about the Romano household staffing arrangements," he said when the call connected. "All right," said his attorney, who was also his oldest friend, and who heard something in Damien's voice that made him set down whatever he was doing. "What kind of arrangements are we talking about?" "Compensation review," Damien said. "Specifically for household staff. I want a full audit of current rates, and I want it on my desk by Wednesday." "Is this about—" "Wednesday?" Damien said. "Okay." He hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he did something he had not done in several years. Something small. Almost nothing that cost him nothing and meant everything to the person on the other end. He walked to the kitchen. Isabella was there resetting the afternoon prep. She heard him come in and turned professional and composed, already reading his face for instruction. He said, "Your brother. The situation you mentioned on the phone." She went very still, not with fear, with the particular stillness of someone who is recalibrating rapidly and isn't quite sure yet what is happening. "Mr. Romano," she said carefully. Is it medical, legal, financial?" A long beat. "Financial," she said. "How much?" Another beat. "I'm not asking for—" "I know you're not asking," he said. "How much?" She told him. He nodded once. "I'll have it arranged by tomorrow," he said. She stared at him. "Mr. Romano, it'll be structured as an advance on salary," he said. "You'll repay it at whatever rate you determine is manageable. No interest, no timeline pressure." "You don't know anything about my brother," she said. Her voice had developed a slight roughness that had not been there a moment ago. "You don't know if he deserves it. You don't know what happened or why he needs it or—" "I know enough," Damien said. "How?" she said. "How do you know enough?" He looked at her. He said, "Because I watched you give your phone to two strangers at a gate. And I watched you take a demotion without complaining to anyone. And I watched you tell my parents, who were strangers to you, that certain things don't change what's right." He paused. "I know enough about you to know enough about him," he said. "People who show up that way for strangers show up that way for the people they love. And people who show up that way for the people they love are worth showing up for." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her face that she was very carefully not letting resolve into tears, and he could see the effort it was costing her, and he respected it. "Why are you doing this?" she said quietly. Damien Romano looked at the woman who had offered his parents warmth when his wife had offered them the gate. He looked at the woman who had given strangers her phone and her coat and her meal and her steadiness and asked for nothing in return. He looked at the woman who moved through his house like a quiet current, unnoticed, uncelebrated, simply and completely there. And he thought about the 3 years he had spent building an empire he had mistaken for a life. "Because," he said, "I spent 3 years surrounded by people who respected my power. And I forgot to notice the people who respected something harder to find." He turned and walked out of the kitchen. He went back to his office. He sat down. He picked up his phone. He called his father. Antonio answered on the second ring. "You watched the footage," Antonio said. Not a question. "I watched it," Damien said. Silence. "Pop," Damien said. "I'm here." "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Antonio was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I needed to be sure. Before I asked you to carry this, I needed to be absolutely sure. And now you're sure." "I was sure the moment your mother touched that girl's hand," Antonio said. "But yes, now I'm sure." Damien exhaled. He looked at the city through the glass. He said, "What do I do?" Pop. And Antonio Romano, who had built his own empire and buried his own mistakes and loved his son through every version of himself the man had ever been, said very quietly, "You already know." And the truth was, he did. He had known since the security room. He had known since the kitchen. He had known in the part of him that had always known things before he was willing to name them, since the moment his father had said those two words at the Brooklyn table. Know her. He knew her now. Both of them. And that knowledge was the beginning of the end of one thing and the beginning of something else entirely. Something he couldn't name yet. Something with no category in the world he had built, but something real. Something that had been in his house for 4 months, moving quietly down his corridors with a cart and a thermos, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. Waiting to be seen. The money reached Marco Cruz's account the following morning. Isabella found out when her phone buzzed at 7:14 while she was stripping linen from the guest suite beds, a message from her brother, 4 words and nothing else. "What did you do?" She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "I didn't do anything. Someone else did." His reply came immediately. "Who?" She looked him at her phone. She looked at the linen bundled in her arms. She looked at the door of the guest suite and the corridor beyond it and the large, complicated house around her. And she thought about how to explain what had happened in terms that made any kind of sense. She typed, "My employer. Don't ask more than that right now. Just get stable." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then Isabella. She knew exactly what he meant by just her name. Her brother could put an entire conversation into a single word when the situation required it, and the word he had just sent her contained, "I don't know how to receive this, and I'm not comfortable with it, and I don't want you owing anything to anyone. And also, thank you all compressed together and delivered in 6 letters. She typed, "I know. We'll talk Sunday. I love you." She put the phone in her pocket. She finished stripping the beds. She went to the laundry room, and she loaded the machine, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the lid after she closed it, just breathing because there was no one in the laundry room at 7:15 in the morning, and she allowed herself that much. Her brother was going to be okay. She didn't let herself think past that yet. She went back to work. She was halfway through her morning rounds when she turned a corner in the east corridor and nearly walked directly into Victoria Romano, who was coming from the opposite direction with purpose in every line of her body, and a look on her face that Isabella recognized immediately as a woman who had spent the night deciding something and had arrived at morning resolved. They stopped 2 feet apart. Isabella took a small step back and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Romano," in the neutral professional voice she had developed for exactly these encounters, the voice that was respectful without being submissive, present without being intrusive. Victoria looked at her for a moment without speaking. It was not an accidental pause. It was deliberate, the kind that powerful people use to remind less powerful people of the distance between them. "Isabella," Victoria said. "Ma'am, I understand my husband reversed your reassignment." "Yes, ma'am." "Without consulting me." A statement, not a question. Isabella said nothing. "In this household," Victoria said, "staffing decisions are my domain. That has always been the arrangement, and it remains the arrangement regardless of—" She paused slightly, "recent developments." "I understand," Isabella said. "Do you—" Victoria's voice had not shifted in volume or temperature, but something in it had tightened by a degree. "Because I want to be clear about something. The incident with the gate with those people was a lapse in protocol. Whatever my husband may have communicated to you about that situation, the management of this household is my responsibility, and I run it according to specific standards." Isabella held her gaze, not defiantly, that would have been stupid, and Isabella Cruz was not stupid, but steadily, with the same quality of stillness she had brought to the kitchen 2 mornings ago. "I understand your standards, Mrs. Romano," she said, "and I respect that this is your household. I was also just trying to help 2 people who were cold." Something moved across Victoria's face, too fast to name completely, but it was there. "Don't make the mistake," Victoria said quietly, of confusing my husband's current mood with a change in the structure of things. Moods pass. Structures remain. She walked past Isabella without waiting for a response. Isabella stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then she turned and went the other way. And as she walked, she thought about the word Victoria had chosen. Mood. The careful diminishment of whatever Damien was going through, reduced to weather. Temporary. Manageable. Something to wait out. She thought about whether Victoria was right. She genuinely did not know. What she knew was that she had a job to do and a brother who was now going to be okay, and a position in this house that had become in the last 48 hours considerably more complicated than the one she had arrived to 4 months ago. She went back to work. The morning continued. Damien Romano, meanwhile, was having a very different kind of morning. He was in his downtown office by 8A Glass and Steel Tower in Midfield, Manhattan, the Romano Group's official face to the business world. And he had been on calls since 6:30, because the Petrov situation had escalated overnight, in the way these situations did, when Vitaly Petrov didn't get the response he expected within the timeline he expected it. Vitaly Petrov was 53 years old, Russian-born, and had been in New York long enough to have learned how to operate in American business environments without ever quite losing the quality that made people instinctively careful around him. He ran 3 import-export companies, 2 legitimate, and 1 that required very careful accounting. The Romano organization had an arrangement with the Petrov network that was 8 years old and had until recently been mutually profitable and professionally frictionless. Until recently. Damien's second-in-command, a compact, precise man named Luca Ferretti, laid it out at 8:15 with the efficiency of someone who had been managing crises for a long time and had learned to present them without editorial. Petrov moved product through our western corridor 3 weeks ago without clearing it through you first, Luca said. We found out through Baltimore. He knows we found out. He requested Thursday's meeting as a, let's say, preemptive conversation. What was the product? Damien said. Nothing we'd have objected to. That's not the point. No, Damien agreed. The point is, he moved without asking. Right, and now he wants to meet on Thursday. I pushed it to Friday. Luca nodded. His people called back this morning. He says Thursday is the only day that works this week. Damien was quiet for a moment. Tell him Friday works, Damien said. Or next Tuesday works. Those are his options. He won't like that. He doesn't need to like it, Damien said. He needs to understand that when he moves without asking, the consequence is that he waits. Tell him exactly that. Respectfully, clearly. Luca made a note. There's something else. There always is. The Morelli family called this morning, Luca said. He was careful with his voice, neutral, informational, but watching Damien's face, with the peripheral attention of a man who knew something was happening and wasn't yet sure of the shape of it. Your father-in-law. He wants to have dinner. This week. The silence in the room had a new quality. Damien set down his pen. Which day, he said. He suggested any day that works for you and Victoria. Damien looked at the window. He looked at the city. He thought about Victoria's phone call, the one she'd made to her brother after he walked out of the sitting room. The one that the house security system had logged as a 14-minute call to a Morelli family cell number. He hadn't listened to the recording. He didn't need to. He knew what kinds of calls lasted 14 minutes and were placed immediately after a confrontation. Tell him we'll be in touch, Damien said. Should I? We'll be in touch, Damien said again. Luca closed his notebook. He stood. He was at the door before Damien said his name. Luca. Boss. How long have you known Victoria was calling her brother regularly? Not the social calls, the other ones. The pause was brief but absolutely honest. Since March, Luca said. And you didn't tell me. Another pause. She's your wife. And until recently there wasn't anything specific enough to. What changed? Luca looked at him steadily. You changed, he said. 3 days ago. Something changed in you, and I figured if you were ready to know, you'd ask. Damien looked at his second-in-command, this precise, careful, loyal man, who had been with him for 11 years, and who apparently had the same instinct as his parents about the difference between information and the right moment to deliver it. "What do the calls contain?" Damien asked. "Household intelligence mostly," Luca said. "Nothing operational. Who's meeting with you, how long, what mood you're in before major decisions. The kind of thing that lets her family anticipate your moves without being directly connected to your operations." The air in the room had changed. Damien was very still. "How long?" he said. "Not since March. The calls. How long has this been happening?" Luca said. "As far as we can trace, since the first year of the marriage." The weight of that settled over the room like something physical. Damien did not move. He did not respond immediately. He sat with it the way he sat with the hardest facts, letting them become real before he decided what to do with them. 3 years. 3 years of a marriage he had believed was at least honest, even if it was strategic. 3 years of believing that the arrangement was mutual, that they both understood what they had built and why, and that within that understanding there was a kind of respect, if not warmth. 3 years of his wife routing information to her family. Not weapons, not operations, not anything that had directly damaged the Romano organization in any way he could identify. But the act itself, the sustained, deliberate, intimate act of living in his house and reporting on him to people whose interests were sometimes aligned with his and sometimes were not. "Thank you," Damien said. His voice was completely level. Luca nodded once and left. Damien sat alone in his office with the city spread out below him, and he thought for a long time about the nature of structures. Victoria had used that word with Isabella. Structures remain. She was right in a way she had perhaps not intended to be. Structures did remain, long after the warmth went out of them, long after the thing that was supposed to live inside them had quietly, gradually, completely left. The structure of a marriage remained. The structure of an alliance remained. The structure of a carefully maintained household and a carefully maintained public image and a carefully maintained lie remained, until something came along and revealed that the structure was all there was. A thermos, a worn coat, 2 elderly people in the cold. He picked up his phone and called Antonio. His father answered immediately, which meant he had been waiting, which meant he already knew something from the tone of Damien's voice the night before. "She's been informing for the Morellis," Damien said. "Since the beginning." Silence. "Pop," Damien said. "I need you to say something." "I know," Antonio said. I'm sorry, son. I hoped it was only what we saw at the gate." "It's not." "No." "What do I do?" "You know what you do," Antonio said quietly. "The question is, how you do it without starting a war you're not prepared to finish right now." "I'm always prepared." "Not for this one," Antonio said. "The Morellis have been planning for this possibility for 3 years, Damien. If they've had someone inside your house for that long, they have contingencies. You move too fast, and you're fighting on ground they've already prepared. So I wait." "You prepare," Antonio said. "There's a difference." Damien closed his eyes briefly. He said, "Isabella Cruz. What do you know about her family?" A pause. "Not the hesitant kind, the considering kind." "Almost nothing," Antonio said. "Why?" "I'm going to need people around me that I can trust without calculating the trust every time," Damien said. "I'm going to need people who have no connection to either side of this. People who are there because they're actually there, not because someone positioned them." Antonio was quiet for a moment. "Damien," he said. "She's a housekeeper." "I know what she is," Damien said. Another pause. Then Antonio said carefully, "Be careful about what you're building toward, and be careful about the speed. She didn't ask for any of this." "I know. She helped 2 strangers because it was right. That's very different from choosing to enter the middle of this." "I know that too," Damien said. He hung up. He sat for another minute. Then he called Luca back in. "I want a full personal background on Isabella Cruz," he said. "Not surveillance. Not a threat assessment. Personal history, family situation, financial picture. Clean work. Respectful. Nothing she'd be uncomfortable knowing we looked at." Luca nodded slowly. "Timeline. By tomorrow." "Is she?" She's not a threat, Damien said. She's the opposite of a threat. I just need to understand who she is. Luca said nothing more. He left to do the work, and Damien went back to the business of managing a day that had become in the space of 72 hours something entirely different from the one he'd expected to be managing when the week began. The rest of the day moved in the compressed high-pressure way that difficult days move when you are simultaneously holding multiple situations in different stages of development. The Petrov situation required 3 more calls. A situation in the Port Newark operation required a decision he needed 30 minutes alone to make correctly. His attorney called about the household compensation audit and delivered numbers that made Damien's jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the attorney. I didn't see Victoria until evening. She was in the formal dining room when he arrived home, already seated, already composed, wearing the particular expression of a woman who has decided to proceed as if nothing fundamental has changed, which is one of the more sophisticated defensive strategies available to a person who has spent their life in social warfare. Damien sat down across from her. The staff served dinner quietly and left. For the first few minutes, the silence between them was the kind that had a surface manageable if you were willing to let it stay surface. Victoria commented on the food. Damien responded. Victoria mentioned an upcoming event. Damien said he would look at the calendar. And then Victoria set down her fork. She looked at him. She said, "We should talk about my father's dinner invitation." "We should," Damien agreed. "He wants to see us," she said. "Together. He mentioned he's been feeling like we've been distant from the family recently." "Has he?" Damien. Her voice was patient in the way that costs something to maintain. "Whatever is happening between us right now, the Morelli relationship is important. To both of us. You know that. Tell me something," Damien said. He set down his own fork. "When you call your brother the regular calls the ones that run 12 to 15 minutes in the afternoon, what do you talk about?" The table went very quiet. Victoria's composure didn't crack, but it shifted a recalibration so fast and so practiced that a less attentive man might have missed it. "Family things," she said. "What kind of family things?" "Damien." "What?" he said very quietly. "Did you tell your brother the day you called him for 14 minutes after our conversation in the sitting room?" Victoria was still. "You're monitoring my phone calls," she said. "I'm running a household," he said, "with a full security system, one that I designed, one that has been running for 3 years. He watched her absorb this, watched her run the calculation. "How much does he know what exactly?" "I told him we were having difficulties," she said finally. "What else?" Another pause. "I told him your mood had shifted," she said, "that you seemed distracted." "And what did he say?" She looked at him directly. "He said it would pass." "I'm sure he did," Damien said. He picked up his fork. He continued eating with the unhurried precision of a man who is not in the business of making things easy for people who have made things difficult for him. "The dinner with your father," he said. "I'll let you know by end of week." "Damien." "End of week," he said. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork, and they finished dinner in a silence that was no longer surface, but was at least maintained. And when the meal was done, she excused herself and went upstairs, and Damien sat alone at the table for a while longer. He thought about what Luca had said. "You changed 3 days ago." I thought about what had changed 3 days ago, and what had actually been changing for longer than that, slowly beneath the surface of a life he had built with such certainty and occupied with such precision, that he had not noticed the thing. It was missing until 2 elderly people sat in the cold outside his gate, and a young woman walked out and offered them a thermos. He thought about Isabella. He thought about what his father had said. She didn't ask for any of this, that was true, and he was going to have to be careful about the distance between what he needed and what was fair to ask of her. He was still thinking about this when his phone buzzed on the table. A message from Luca. 3 words. Background ready. Tomorrow. He typed back, "My office." 8. He put the phone in his pocket. He went upstairs. He passed Victoria's sitting room, the door closed, a line of light at the bottom, the faint sound of her on the phone again. He did not stop. I went to his study. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He stared at the screen for a moment without seeing it. Then he typed a name. Isabella Cruz. Not because Luca hadn't already done the search. Luca was thorough, and Damien would have everything he needed by morning. But because he wanted to sit with the name for a moment. The ordinary, unguarded reality of it. A person who had come to work in his house and had done something so simple that the entire architecture of his life was still reverberating from it. He closed the laptop. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. What he kept returning to in the long dark hours was not the betrayal, though, that was there, solid and cold, and waiting to be dealt with. What he kept returning to was the footage. The moment Isabella had come out of the kitchen door, the directness of her walk, the absence of performance. He thought about what it meant that he had looked at that footage and felt beneath all the other things he was feeling, something he had not felt in a very long time. Not attraction exactly. Not yet, or at least not in any form he was prepared to name. Something more fundamental. Recognition. The feeling of seeing something real in a world that had become without him, quite noticing almost entirely performed. He lay in the dark, and he thought about recognition and what you were supposed to do with it when everything around it was in pieces and the pieces were sharp. Morning came. Luca's report was thorough, clean, and deeply human in a way that profiles rarely were. Isabella Maria Cruz, 27 years old. Born in Providence, Rhode Island. Raised by a single mother, Consuela, who had worked 2 jobs for most of Isabella's childhood, a cleaning service during the week and a restaurant on weekends. Isabella had been the oldest of 3. She had helped with the younger 2 from the time she was old enough to carry one of them on her hip without assistance. She had been a strong student, had received a partial scholarship to a state college, had left after 2 years when her mother's hours were cut and the financial math stopped working. Had worked continuously since then, hotel housekeeping, private households, one brief stint in restaurant service that she'd left after 3 months, cited in the employment records as position not aligned with applicants' longer-term goals, which Luca had noted in the margin with the word honest. She sent money home every month without exception. The brother Marco, 24. The financial situation. Damien already knew about. No criminal record. No debt beyond a student loan that was in good standing. No affiliations, organizational or otherwise, that raised any question. At the bottom of the file, Luca had written a single line in his own handwriting, which he did not usually do in reports. She is exactly who she appears to be. Damien read that line 3 times. He set the report on his desk. He sat back in his chair, and he looked at the ceiling, and he understood fully, and without remaining ambiguity, what he was dealing with. On one side, a woman who had lived inside his house and his life for 3 years, and had been feeding information to his most significant business rival, while maintaining the surface of a marriage with the professional skill of a person who had been trained for exactly this kind of long game. On the other side, a woman who had worked in his house for 4 months and had given a cold stranger her coat and her phone and her time, and had never, as far as any evidence could establish, been anything other than exactly what she was. He had made Damien understood a profoundly costly error of judgment 3 years ago. He was not yet sure what the correction would cost, but he knew it was coming. He knew it was necessary. And he knew in the place where he made the decisions that actually mattered, the place beneath strategy and calculation, and the long game, that he was not going to spend another 3 years inside a structure that had never once been warm. He picked up his phone. He called Victoria. She answered immediately. "We need to have a conversation," he said. "This weekend. Not a dinner, not a social event, a real conversation." A pause. "About what?" she said. "About the structure of things," he said. "You mentioned that word to Isabella. You said structures remain. You were right. They do." He paused. "But not every structure deserves to remain." The silence on the line was the specific silence of a woman who is very intelligent and who has just understood that the ground has shifted further than she calculated. "Damien," she said. "This weekend," he said. "We'll talk." He hung up. He went to the window. He thought about his father's voice on the phone the day before. She didn't ask for any of this. No, she hadn't. But sometimes the person who changes everything doesn't ask to. Sometimes they just walk out a door with a thermos in the cold, and the act is so simple and so real that it cracks something open in a world that had grown too sealed, too managed, too expensive, and too empty to feel anything anymore. Isabella Cruz hadn't chosen to be the axis around which the Romano family was turning. But she was. And downstairs in the main kitchen, the woman in question was preparing the staff lunch schedule and thinking about her brother and not thinking about any of this, because she had learned in the long, clear school of her own life that you could not carry what hadn't arrived yet. You dealt with what was in front of you. You kept your hands busy. You kept your standards intact. And you trusted that the right things added up over time amounted to something solid. What she did not know, could not know not yet, was that the right things she had already done were about to change everything. Not just for the Romano family, for herself. And the people trying to use the Romano family against itself were about to discover something that all the intelligence gathering in the world hadn't told them. That the most dangerous thing in a house full of power is not power at all. It is a person who cannot be bought, cannot be turned, and does not know how to stop doing what is right. That was the thing the Morelli family had not factored into their calculations, and it was about to cost them. The weekend conversation Damien had promised Victoria did not happen on Saturday. It happened on Sunday morning, and it happened because Victoria made the mistake of forcing it. She came to his study at 8:15 while he was still on a call with Luca about the Petrov meeting, which had finally been confirmed for Monday, on Damien's terms at Damien's office at a time. Damien chose, and she knocked once and opened the door without waiting, which was something she had never done before in 3 years of marriage. Damien looked at her. He held up one finger 1 minute and finished the call with Luca in under 30 seconds, not because she had asked him to, but because the conversation was done, and because he recognized from the quality of her expression that whatever she had decided to do, she had been building toward it since his phone call Friday morning and was no longer capable of waiting. He put the phone down. "Close the door," he said. She did. She sat in the chair across from his desk. The chair his attorneys used, the chair across which he had conducted 1,000 negotiations, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who had chosen her opening and was committed to it. "I want to talk about what's happening," she said. "So do I." "Not the way you want to talk about it," she said. "I don't want an interrogation. I want an actual conversation. Between two people who have built something together for 3 years and who are apparently now on opposite sides of something that neither of us wanted to arrive at." Damien looked at her for a moment. He said, "Tell me about the calls to your brother." Victoria's composure held. It was impressive he could admit that even now. The woman had a capacity for self-possession under pressure that very few people he had ever encountered could match. "I talk to my family," she said. "That's not a crime." "The content of those conversations is the question," Damien said, "not the frequency." "I share things with my brother that I don't always feel I can share with you," she said. "That's what siblings are for. That's a normal, Victoria." His voice was quiet and completely final. "I have 3 years of logged calls. I have Luca's analysis of the patterns. I know what was discussed, and I know the timeline. I'm not asking you to confess. I'm asking you to be honest with me for the first time since we've been married." The room was very still. Victoria looked at him. And then something happened that Damien had not expected and would not forget. She took a breath, and she told him the truth. Not all of it. He understood that, even as she spoke. There were layers she was keeping back, contingencies she was protecting, things she had agreed to that she was not yet prepared to name out loud. But beneath all of that, through all of that, there was a thread of actual honesty that she allowed him to follow. "My father asked me," she said, "before the wedding. He said that the Romano organization had connections that the Morelli family needed access to, and that I was the access point. He said it didn't have to be complicated. Just stay aware. Pay attention. Pass along anything relevant." "And you agreed?" "I was 26 years old," she said, "and my father asked me." "That's not an answer." It's the only answer I have, she said. I was raised in a family where your father's asks were not optional. You know something about that. Damien said nothing. She looked down at her folded hands for a moment. Then she looked back up. I want to be honest with you about something else, she said. Something I didn't expect. He waited. I didn't expect to... She stopped. Started again. The first year I thought of this as a role, something I was performing. And then somewhere in the second year that became more complicated. Because you were more complicated than I expected. And I didn't know what to do with that. So you kept calling your brother. I didn't know how to stop, she said. I didn't know how to go to my father and say I wanted out. And I didn't know how to come to you and say everything I just told you. Damien was quiet for a long time. He thought about what his father had said. They have contingencies. You move too fast, and you're fighting on ground they've already prepared. He thought about Luca's report. She is exactly who she appears to be. He thought about Isabella Cruz, and he thought about Victoria Romano, and he thought about the distance between those two sentences, and what that distance said about the 3 years he had spent inside this house. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer it completely. All right. What do they have, he said. Your family. What have you given them that they can use against me if this falls apart? Victoria was very still. Damien. Tell me, he said, because I need to know the shape of what's coming. I need to know what they think they're holding before I walk into whatever they've prepared. A long pause. Then she told him. It was not as catastrophic as it could have been. 3 years of household intelligence, his mood patterns before decisions, his meeting schedules, the broad outlines of his organizational relationships. Nothing operational. Nothing that gave them direct leverage over the Romano criminal structure. But enough. Enough to anticipate his moves in the legitimate business world, enough to position the Morelli family to benefit from Romano decisions, before those decisions were public enough to give them an edge in the political relationships that both families competed for. And one thing more. One thing that Victoria delivered in a voice that was quieter than all the others. My brother knows about the Port Newark arrangement, she said. The details. He's had them since February. The room went very cold. Damien did not move. The Port Newark arrangement was not a small thing. It was not something that could be handled with a conversation or a negotiation or a strategic realignment of relationships. It was, if used as leverage in the wrong hands at the wrong moment, potentially the most damaging thing anyone outside the Romano organization had ever possessed. How did he get that? Damien said. I didn't give it to him, Victoria said. Her voice was urgent with something he had not heard from her before. Real fear. Damien, I need you to hear that. I didn't give him that. I don't know how he got it. I found out 2 weeks ago when he mentioned something specific in conversation, a detail I had never told him, and I realized. He has another source, Damien said. Yes. Inside my organization. I think so, she said. I don't know who, I don't know how long, but yes. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who is containing a very large and very dangerous response by sheer discipline. He stood. He walked to the window. He stood there for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he turned around. Pack a bag, he said. Victoria blinked. What? Not to leave, he said. Not permanently. But you cannot stay in this house for the next week while I deal with this. It's not safe for you, and it's not operationally manageable for me to have you in the middle of what I need to do. Damien. I'm not punishing you, he said. And he meant it not out of forgiveness, not yet, but out of the particular clarity that danger produces in a man who has been navigating danger his entire adult life. I'm managing a situation. There's a difference. She looked at him. Where would I go? She said. Anywhere your family is not, he said. I'll have Marcus arrange it. She nodded. She stood. She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. He looked at her, really looked at her the way he had looked at her at the beginning of this week and had not been able to do at the beginning of their marriage because he had not known what he was looking for. The thing you said, he said. In the second year, That I was more complicated than you expected. She waited. I was simpler than I should have been, he said. I chose this because of what your family represented, and I stopped paying attention to the person inside it. That's on me. Something moved across her face. Not relief, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like being seen for the first time and not knowing whether to be grateful or devastated. That doesn't fix anything, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She left. Damien stood in the study for a moment longer. Then he called Luca. We have a secondary source inside the organization, he said. Someone gave the Morellis the Port Newark details. I need you to find out who, and I need you to do it without alerting anyone to the fact that we're looking. Luca's response was immediate and professional. Timeline. Fast, Damien said. But clean. If we move wrong on this, we hand them the disruption they're looking for. Understood. And Luca, nobody outside this call knows what I just told you. Not yet. Of course. He hung up. He sat down. I thought about the shape of the next several days. The Petrov meeting Monday. The internal search for the secondary source, which would require extraordinary delicacy. The Morelli family, who now knew via Victoria's reaction to his Friday call, if nothing else, that something had shifted and were almost certainly repositioning. The Romano organization, which needed to continue functioning at full capacity through all of it, because any visible disruption would be read as weakness. And weakness in this world invited exactly the kind of pressure you could least afford. How was managing 6 things simultaneously? He was used to this. What he was not used to was managing all of it, while also navigating the particular unprecedented, quietly disorienting awareness that somewhere in this house, going about the ordinary business of an ordinary Sunday morning, was a person who had nothing to do with any of it, and whose presence had somehow become the still point around which all of it was turning. He was thinking about this when his phone buzzed. Not Luca, not Marcus. Antonio, he answered. Your mother wants to come, his father said without preamble. Come where to? To the house. She's been worried since the call Friday. She wants to pop. Damien pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. This is not the moment for. I know, Antonio said. That's what I told her. But I'm calling because she's going to come anyway, and I thought you'd rather know in advance. Despite everything, despite all of it, Damien almost smiled. Tomorrow, he said. Tell her tomorrow, not today. I'll tell her today, Antonio said. She'll arrive tomorrow. He hung up. Damien put the phone on the desk. He thought about his mother, Sophia Romano, who had put on a thrift store coat and worn shoes and gone to her son's gate, because she loved him enough to do the uncomfortable thing before the situation became the unmanageable thing. Sophia, who had touched Isabella's hand in the cold and made a decision with that touch that was already a week later reshaping the foundations of an empire. He thought about what it would mean to have her in the house while he was managing all of this. Then he thought about what it would mean to have her in the house for Isabella. He picked up the phone again. He called Marcus. Mrs. Romano Sr. is arriving tomorrow, he said. Make sure the guest suite on the East Wing is prepared, and tell the kitchen staff she has opinions about breakfast. Let her express them. Yes, sir, Marcus said. Then carefully, Mr. Romano, there's something I need to bring to your attention. Damien went still. Marcus was not a man who said there's something I need to bring to your attention lightly. Tell me. One of the staff came to me this morning, Marcus said. Voluntarily, with information I think you need to hear directly. Which staff member? A brief pause. Isabella Cruz. Damien sat forward in his chair. She asked to speak with me this morning off the regular schedule privately. She said she'd seen something she wasn't sure what to do with, and she didn't want to do nothing with it. What did she see? 2 nights ago, Marcus said. Late. She was up because she couldn't sleep. She said she sometimes works through linen inventory on nights she can't sleep. It keeps her hands busy. She was in the back corridor near the service stairs, and she heard a conversation. Damien waited. Between your wife, Marcus said, and a man she didn't recognize. a visitor who came in through the service entrance. She said the conversation lasted about 15 minutes. She didn't hear all of it, but she heard enough. What did she hear? Marcus read from his notes. Damien listened. The man had come at 11:40 at night through the service entrance, the entrance used by staff deliveries, invisible traffic. Victoria had met him there. Isabella had heard fragments, a name, the Newark file, and a timeline before Monday, and one sentence complete and clear that Isabella had repeated to Marcus verbatim. "Tell my brother we'll be ready when Damien moves." Damien closed his eyes. He opened them. He said, "Is Isabella still with you?" "She's in my office," Marcus said. "She said she wanted to make sure I actually told you." "Put her on." A brief shuffle. Then her voice steady, careful with the slight roughness that he was beginning to recognize as the sound of Isabella Cruz in the presence of something that required her to be brave. "Mr. Romano." "You went to Marcus," he said. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. "I thought about not saying anything. This is your family. It's not my business. But then I thought." "What did you think?" A pause. "I thought about your parents," she said. "About why they came to the gate. About what they were trying to protect." Another pause. "I thought if I stayed quiet and something happened because I stayed quiet, I couldn't live with that." Damien said nothing for a moment. The thing that moved through him then was not strategy. It was not calculation. It was something older and simpler and harder to manage than either of those. He said, "Thank you, Isabella." A small silence. "You should know," she said, "that after I heard the conversation, I realized the man who came in, I'd seen him once before. Last month. He was in the kitchen talking to one of the prep staff. The conversation seemed normal at the time, but now I'm thinking it wasn't." Damien's grip on the phone tightened. "Which prep staff member?" she told him. "A man named Daniel Park, who had been with the household for 8 months, 2 months longer than Isabella. 4 months longer than the new security rotation that hadn't recognized Antonio and Sofia at the gate." Luca had his secondary source. Damien said, "Isabella, I need you to go back to your normal routine. Don't change anything about how you're acting, or where you're going, or how you interact with any of the other staff. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Don't speak to Daniel Park differently than you normally do. Don't avoid him. Don't engage him specifically. Just be normal." "I understand," she said. "I know you do," he said. And he meant it in more ways than he was going to say on this call. Marcus came back on the line. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Nothing yet," Damien said. "Watch, document. Let it run for exactly 48 more hours. I need the Petrov meeting to happen first, and I need to handle the Morelli situation on a timeline of my choosing, not theirs." "And Daniel Park?" "He stays in place until I say otherwise," Damien said. "A man who doesn't know he's been made is more valuable than one who's been removed." "Understood," Marcus said. Damien hung up. He sat completely still for 30 seconds. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and walked downstairs with the controlled, purposeful movement of a man who has taken the full measure of a situation and is no longer surprised by any of it. He found Isabella in the kitchen. She was doing exactly what she had said she would do, her normal routine, moving through the morning prep with the same quiet efficiency she always brought to it. Her face neutral, her hands steady. She looked up when he came in. He looked at her. He said quietly enough that only she could hear, "You did the right thing." "I hope so," she said. "You did," he said. "And I need you to know something." He paused, choosing the words with care. "What you did this morning took more courage than most people in this house have ever shown me, and I don't take that lightly." Isabella looked at him for a moment. She said, "Can I say something?" "Yes. I'm a housekeeper," she said. Not with bitterness, with clarity. "I don't have power in this situation. I don't have connections or leverage or a family that can protect me if this goes wrong. All I have is a job I need and a sense of what's right." She paused. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel obligated. I'm telling you because you should know that I understand my position, and I still came to Marcus. Not because I'm brave, but because I couldn't do nothing." Damien Romano looked at this woman, 27 years old, a thrift store coat, and worn shoes in the memory of another woman he loved. A thermos in the cold, a phone offered to strangers, and he understood something that all the intelligence reports and security footage and organizational analysis in the world could not have told him. She wasn't brave because she had nothing to lose. She was brave because she understood exactly what she could lose and chose what was right anyway. That was a different thing, a rarer thing. He said, "You're not just a housekeeper in this house anymore, Isabella. I want you to know that." She looked at him steadily. "I'm also not looking to be anything else," she said. He nodded. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be." He left the kitchen. He went directly to Luca's number. "Daniel Park is the source," he said. "The visitor who came through the service entrance 2 nights ago is the Morelli contact. I want the full connection mapped by tonight." "I'll have it," Luca said. "And the Petrov meeting tomorrow, I want you with me. Full preparation. This meeting is not just about Petrov anymore." A pause. "You think they're connected? I think," Damien said, "that when a man moves product through your corridor without asking the same week your wife's brother sends a contact through your service entrance, you stop believing in coincidences." "I'll have everything ready," Luca said. Damien pocketed his phone. He walked to the front of the house. He stood at the window that faced the gate, the same gate his parents had stood outside, the same gate where a thermos had changed everything, and he looked at it for a long time. He thought about the word his father had used on that Brooklyn Sunday morning. No. He knew now. He knew Victoria. He knew the Morelli shape. He knew his secondary source. He knew the timeline they were working toward. He knew the Newark file was what they were hoping to use, and he knew they were planning to use it before Monday, which meant they were planning to use it tomorrow, which meant the Petrov meeting was either bait or cover or both. He knew all of this because an ordinary woman with a linen cart and a personal phone and an inability to do nothing had moved through his house for 4 months and seen things clearly, and when it mattered, said them out loud. He turned away from the window. He went to his study. He sat down. He opened the Newark file himself, the real one, his version, the one with the components the Morellis had, and the significant components they didn't, and he began to prepare. Not the preparation of a man caught off guard. The preparation of a man who has turned the board, seen the full position, and is ready to play. And in the kitchen below, Isabella Cruz set the lunch service, and kept her face neutral, and her hands busy, and tried very hard not to think about what she had set in motion, and whether she was prepared for wherever it went. Her phone buzzed. "Marco, you doing okay?" She looked at the message for a long moment. She typed, "Yes. Working. How are you?" His reply, "Better. Thanks to whoever did that. Tell them I said so." She smiled small private reel and put the phone back in her pocket. She kept working. Upstairs, Victoria Romano packed a bag with the methodical focus of a woman who is maintaining composure by keeping her hands occupied, which was something she and Isabella Cruz had in common without knowing it, and in a townhouse in Brooklyn. Sofia Romano told Antonio she was going to the Westchester house tomorrow, and Antonio said he knew, and she said, "How did you know?" And he said, "Because I know you." And she reached across the kitchen table and took his hand, the way she had been taking it for 41 years, and said, "Our son is going to be okay." Antonio looked at their hands. He thought about a girl with a thermos. He thought about the particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. I thought about what it took to build an empire, and what it cost, and what it was worth, and what in the end, in the place beneath all of it, actually mattered. "Yes," he said. "He is." And the next morning came with the particular cold clarity of a day that has been waiting. The Petrov meeting was at 9. Damien was ready at 7. And somewhere between 7 and 9, the Morelli family made their move. Not the one they had planned, not on the timeline they had designed, but the one that happens when careful people realize they have been outpaced and try to accelerate before the window closes. They called Damien directly. Not Victoria's brother. The father himself, Carlo Morelli, 61 years old. The kind of man who had spent 4 decades being so careful that caution had become indistinguishable from his personality. He called Damien at 7:43. And the thing he said, the opening he chose, the way he framed the first sentence told Damien everything he needed to know about how much the man knew and how much he didn't, and exactly where the gap was. The gap Damien was going to walk through. Damien, sure, Carlo said. His voice was warm, the warmth of a man who is using warmth as a tool. I hear things have been difficult at home. I want you to know, family is family. Whatever happens between you and Victoria, the Morelli relationship with the Romano organization doesn't change. You have my word. Damien said, I appreciate that, Carlo. A beat. I want to have dinner, Carlo said. This week. Just us. Two men who have built things together and who understand each other. Of course, Damien said. I'll call you after Monday. After Monday, Carlo repeated. Why after Monday specifically? And there it was, the tell. The small, clean, unavoidable crack in the performance of a man who knew what Monday meant and hadn't meant to reveal it. Damien said, I have a business meeting Monday morning. Just housekeeping. Nothing significant. Of course, Carlo said. His voice had recovered, but the recovery itself was a tell. Tuesday then. Tuesday works, Damien said. He hung up. He looked at Luca across the desk. Luca had heard the call. He said, he knows about Petrov. He put it together, Damien said. Or Park told them. They think the Petrov meeting is about something it isn't, and they're planning to use the Newark material as leverage during or immediately after. He stood. Which means the meeting isn't just a meeting. It's a trap, Luca said. It's an attempt, Damien said. There's a difference. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up his phone. He thought about everything that had brought him to this morning. The gate, the thermos, the footage, the Brooklyn kitchen, the 14-minute phone call, the service entrance visitor, the linen inventory at midnight, the woman who couldn't do nothing. He thought about what his father had said. An empire built without humanity is just an expensive prison. He walked toward the door. He said without turning, let's go. And Luca Ferretti, who had been with Damien Romano for 11 years, and who had watched him walk into 100 difficult rooms, followed him out of the office, and thought not for the first time this week, but with more certainty than before, that something fundamental had changed in the man. Not his intelligence, not his discipline, not his capacity for the particular necessary ruthlessness of the world he operated in. Something beneath all of that, something that had been missing for longer than either of them had known to name it. And whatever it was making him sharper. Not colder. Sharper. There was a difference, and that difference was about to matter enormously. The Petrov meeting lasted 47 minutes. Damien had expected 90. Vitaly Petrov walked into the Romano Group's conference room at 9:03 with two men behind him and the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed a position and is committed to it, regardless of what the room tells him. He was a careful man, Petrov. A patient man. A man who had survived 3 decades in a brutal industry by reading situations quickly and adjusting before the adjustment became necessary. He read the room in under 10 seconds, and something in his face changed, because the room told him something he hadn't expected. Damien was not defensive. Damien was not positioned for negotiation. Damien was not in any of the ways that Petrov had prepared for reactive. He was sitting at the head of the table with Luca, beside him and 2 other Romano lieutenants flanking the table, and the quality of his stillness was the specific stillness of a man who already knows how this ends and is simply waiting for the other person to arrive at the same understanding. Petrov sat down. He began his prepared opening the product movement through the Western Corridor, the explanation, the framing of it as a miscommunication rather than a violation, the implied suggestion that the Romano organization's response had been disproportionate. Damien let him finish. Then he said, Vitaly, I'm going to stop you because I think we're having the wrong meeting. Petrov looked at him. The corridor situation is manageable, Damien said. You know that and I know that. You move without asking. I make you wait. You understand the reminder, we move forward. That's not why you wanted this meeting on Thursday. A careful pause from Petrov. Then why did I want it Thursday, he said. Because someone told you it mattered that we meet before Monday, Damien said. And you wanted to understand why. The room went very still. Petrov's two men exchanged a look that was fast and small and entirely visible to everyone at the Romano table. Petrov said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, I don't know what you think you know, Damien. I know Carlo Morelli reached out to you 6 weeks ago, Damien said. I know he suggested that the Romano organization was entering a period of instability. I know he implied there would be opportunities in that instability, and that positioning yourself closer to Morelli interests before Monday would put you on the right side of whatever came next. Petrov was very still. I know, Damien continued, his voice completely level, that you were skeptical because you're not a man who moves on implication alone, which is why you requested this meeting not to resolve the corridor situation, but to take my temperature, to see if what Morelli told you was true. A long pause. Petrov said, and is it? Damien looked at him. Does this feel like instability to you? He said. Another pause. Petrov looked around the table. He looked at Luca, who returned his gaze with perfect professional calm. He looked at the two Romano lieutenants. He looked back at Damien. He said no. No. Damien agreed. It doesn't. He opened a folder on the table, a single document placed face down, which he turned over now and slid across to Petrov. That's a revised corridor agreement. More favorable terms than the current one. A formal acknowledgement that last week's movement is resolved. And a clear structure for communication going forward that doesn't require you to choose between speed and protocol. Petrov looked at the document. He looked at Damien. Why? He said. Because you've been a reliable partner for 8 years, Damien said. And because I'd rather reward that reliability than punish one miscalculation. And because I want you to be very clear when you call Carlo Morelli back about what you found in this room today. Petrov was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the document. He read it. He set it down. He said, I'll have my attorney review this today. Take your time, Damien said. The meeting was over in 47 minutes. Petrov left with his two men and the document and the clear and unmistakable understanding that whatever the Morelli family had told him about Damien Romano's condition, the intelligence had been wrong. The Romano organization was not entering instability. It was, if anything, more settled than it had been in years. When the conference room was empty, Luca looked at Damien and said, that was clean. Petrov is smart enough to know when he's been used, Damien said. He'll be angry at the Morellis for the bad intelligence. That's useful. And Carlo's call Tuesday. Carlo doesn't know yet that Petrov just walked out of here with a better deal than he came in with, Damien said. He'll find out by end of business today, which means Tuesday's dinner is going to be a very different conversation than Carlo is planning for. He stood. And Daniel Park, Luca said. Tonight, Damien said. After the house settles, I want it handled quietly. No drama. He walks out with 2 weeks' pay and an understanding that what he knows stays with him. And if it doesn't? Damien looked at him. Luca nodded. Tonight, he said. They left the conference room, in the Romano family townhouse in Brooklyn. Sofia. Romano had been packed since 6 in the morning and was sitting at the kitchen table drinking her second coffee and looking at Antonio with the expression she wore when she was ready to go and was waiting for him to stop pretending he had reasons for her to stay. She'll be fine, Antonio said. I know she'll be fine, Sofia said. That's not why I want to go. Then why? Sofia wrapped both hands around her mug. Because that girl has been carrying something very heavy in a house full of people who weren't paying attention, and I want her to know that someone sees it. Antonio looked at his wife. He said, You've known Isabella Cruz for 2 mornings. I've known her type my whole life, Sofia said. I was her type. Before you, before the money, before any of it. She paused. She needs to know she's not invisible. Antonio stood. He picked up his car keys. Let's go, he said. Sofia was already standing. They arrived at the Westchester house at 11:15. Marcus met them at the gate, the real Marcus, the one who had been with the family 6 years and who recognized them on sight, and he brought them through without ceremony, with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that some arrivals were more significant than others, and that this was one of them. Sophia went directly to the kitchen. Isabella was there as she almost always was at that hour, working through the midday prep with the particular focused efficiency that was her professional signature. She looked up when Sophia came in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophia said, "I owe you an apology." Isabella blinked. "Mrs. Romano." "I came into your house in disguise," Sophia said. "I sat at your table and let you feed me and offer me your phone, and I didn't tell you who I was. And that was not fair to you." Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't know if you could trust me." "I know now," Sophia said. Isabella looked at this woman, elegant, even without the thrift store coat, warm in the way that certain people are warm in every register of themselves, and she felt something move through her chest that she didn't entirely know what to do with. "You don't need to apologize," Isabella said. "You were protecting your son." "I was," Sophia said. "But you were protecting two strangers for no reason, except that it was right. That's a different kind of thing." She paused. "That's the kind of thing I wanted my son to see." Isabella looked down at her hands for a moment. When she looked back up, she said, "Is he okay? Damien, is he going to be okay?" Sophia looked at her carefully. The way she had looked at her at the concrete barrier in the cold, making the quiet decision that she had been making all week. "He's going to be fine," she said. "He's better than he's been in a long time, and that has a lot to do with you." "I just went to Marcus," Isabella said. "You went to Marcus when you could have stayed quiet," Sophia said. "In a house full of people who had chosen to stay quiet for 3 years. Do you understand what that means?" Isabella didn't answer, because she was not entirely sure she was ready to understand what it meant. She was still in the part of the process where she was taking each day as it came and doing the next right thing, and not thinking too far ahead. Because thinking too far ahead in a situation, this complex, led to places she wasn't equipped to navigate yet. Sophia seemed to understand this. She did not push. She simply sat down at the staff table, the same table where she had sat a week ago in a thrift store coat, and she said, "Tell me about your brother." And Isabella Cruz, who was not a woman who talked about herself, sat down across from Sophia Romano and talked about Marco. She talked about Providence and her mother, and the 2 jobs, and the partial scholarship, and the 2 years of college, and the decision to leave. She talked about the way Marco had always been the smart one, the one with the most potential, the one she had been most certain would find his way to something solid. She talked about the job that dissolved, and the savings that ran out, and the phone call with its 3 careful words. Sophia listened the way people listen when they have spent a lifetime actually listening, not waiting for their turn to speak, but taking in what was being said with the full weight of their attention. When Isabella finished, Sophia said, "Your brother is going to be fine." "I know," Isabella said, "because of what Damien did." "Because of what you are," Sophia said. "Damien did what he did because of what he saw in you. The 2 things are connected." Isabella looked at her. "Mrs. Romano," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "What is this?" she said. "What is happening in this house? Because a week ago I was a housekeeper, and now I went to Marcus because I couldn't not. And now I'm sitting in the kitchen having a real conversation with Damien Romano's mother, and I don't know what the boundaries are anymore. And I need to know the boundaries." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest question anyone has asked in this house in 3 years." I mean it sincerely," Isabella said. "I know you do," Sophia said. "And I'll give you a sincere answer. The boundaries are exactly what you set them to be. My son is not a man who imposes. He's a man who for a long time chose badly because he was choosing with the part of himself that calculates rather than the part that feels. What's happening now is that the other part has woken up. What that means for you is entirely up to you." Isabella absorbed this. She said, "He's in the middle of something serious." "He's always in the middle of something serious," Sophia said. "That's not new. What's new is how he's handling it." "And Victoria." A pause. "Victoria made her choices," Sophia said quietly. "And Damien is making his." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Isabella stood. She went back to the prep counter. She kept working. And Sofia Romano sat at the staff table with her coffee and watched the young woman move through her kitchen with the quiet competence of someone who had never needed anyone to tell her what she was worth. And she thought, good. She knows herself. That's the most important thing. That evening, Daniel Park left the Romano household with 2 weeks' pay in an envelope and a conversation with Marcus that left absolutely no ambiguity about the terms of his departure and the expectations attached to it. He did not argue. He had understood from the moment Marcus called him in that the conversation was already over, and what remained was only the formality of its conclusion. He left. The house exhaled, not dramatically, not with any visible change in its surface or its daily operations. But something shifted in the atmosphere, the particular easing that happens in a space when something that had been wrong in it for a long time is finally removed. Isabella felt it without knowing exactly what had caused it. She noticed that Marcus seemed lighter, that the kitchen staff moved with slightly less of the careful watchfulness that she had taken until now to be simply the natural condition of working in a high-security household. She didn't ask questions. She kept working. She was finishing the evening linen inventory, the task she had taken on during sleepless nights. The task that had put her in the back corridor 2 nights ago. The task that had changed everything when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Isabella. Damien's voice. She stood up straighter without quite deciding to. Mr. Romano, she said. I'm calling to tell you something, he said. And I want you to hear it directly from me, not from Marcus or my mother or the general atmosphere of the house. She waited. The situation is resolved, he said. The person who was a problem has left the house. The external situation is under control. You are safe. Your position here is not in any jeopardy. And what you did going to Marcus made a significant difference to the outcome. She let out a breath she had not entirely known she was holding. Thank you for telling me, she said. I should have told you earlier in the day, he said. I'm sorry it took until now. A pause. She said, Is there anything else you need from me? A brief silence on his end. Then, not tonight, he said. Get some sleep. You too, she said. She hung up. She stood in the linen room for a moment. Then she called Marco. He answered immediately because he had been waiting for her call, the way he always waited for her calls, with the particular patience of a younger sibling who has learned that his sister will always come through, but will come through on her own timeline. Hey, he said. Hey, she said. How are you? Better, he said. A lot better. Isabella, tell me what happened, all of it. She sat down on the linen room floor, which was not dignified but was comfortable, and she told her brother everything. Not the operational details, those weren't hers to share, but the human story of it. The gate, the thermos, the cold, the kitchen, the footage, the conversation with Damien, the money and the salary advance, and the conversation with Sofia at the staff table. Marco listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You walked into a Mafia family's house, and you were just you. I was just doing my job, she said. No, Marco said. You were doing something harder than your job. You were being a person when it would have been a lot easier not to be. She didn't answer. You know what I think, he said. What? I think you changed something in that family, he said. Not because you tried to, because you didn't try to, because you just kept being exactly who you are in a place full of people who'd forgotten how to do that. A pause. That's not a small thing, Isabella. She was quiet. Go to sleep, Marco said. You sound tired. I am tired, she said. Isabella. Yeah, I love you, he said. And I'm going to be okay. And you're going to be okay. And whatever happens next, you'll handle it. You always do. She said, I love you too. She hung up. She got off the floor. She went to bed. 3 weeks passed. They were not quiet weeks. No weeks, in the Romano world, were quiet. And the weeks that followed, the resolution of the Morelli situation, were particularly full of the specific compressed activity that happens when a large and complex organization reasserts its clarity of direction after a period of internal disruption. The Tuesday dinner with Carlo Morelli happened. Damien attended alone. He sat across from Carlo in a restaurant that Carlo had chosen, which was a message, and he ate the meal and listened to Carlo's very careful, very controlled, very well-rehearsed version of events, in which the intelligence sharing had been minor and well-intentioned, and entirely within the normal scope of family relationships between allied organizations. Damien listened to all of it. Then he laid out with the precise and methodical clarity of a man who has done his preparation and is not in the habit of leaving anything on the table exactly what he knew. The timeline, the calls, the service entrance contact, the Port Newark material, the Petrov approach. Carlo's face went through several stages. Damien let it go through them. Then he said, "I'm not going to war with you, Carlo. That's not good for either of us, and I don't think it's what you actually want." Carlo said, "Then what do you want?" "I want the Newark material returned," Damien said. "All copies, verified, by the end of this week. And in return, we continue the existing relationship on revised terms. Terms that don't include anyone in your family inside my house." A long pause. "Victoria," Carlo said carefully. "That's between Victoria and me," Damien said. "Not you and me." Carlo looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The material will be returned by Friday." "Thank you," Damien said. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He said, "Carlo, you have a talented family. The Morelli organization is genuinely impressive. You didn't need to do this." Carlo said nothing. "The mistake," Damien said, "was thinking that because my house had a weakness I did." He left. The Newark material arrived by Thursday, a day early. Victoria called him the following Sunday. She was in a hotel in Connecticut, the one Marcus had arranged. She had been there for 2 weeks, and Damien had spoken to her 3 times during that period. Brief, careful, honest conversations that were not what either of them would have chosen, but were what the situation required. She called on Sunday morning, and he answered, and she said, "I think we both know where this is going." "Yes," he said. "I don't want it to be ugly," she said. "It won't be," he said. A pause. "I didn't expect to feel this way about it," she said. Her voice was quiet. Not broken. Romano did not break in audible ways, but with a quality that was the closest he had ever heard her come to genuine vulnerability. "I didn't expect to care," he said. "I know." "That's not enough, is it?" she said. Not a question. "No," he said. "But it's something, and I won't forget it." Another pause. "The girl," Victoria said. "Isabella." Damien waited. Victoria stopped. Started again. "Don't make her into something she didn't ask to be. She's not a symbol. She's a person." Damien said, "I know that." "Good," Victoria said. And for the first time in the entire conversation, there was something in her voice that was almost warm. Not toward him, not exactly. Toward the situation. Toward the complicated, costly, honest mess of it. "Take care of yourself, Damien." "You too," he said. She hung up. He sat with the phone for a moment. He thought about what she had said. She's not a symbol. She's a person. And the strange, unexpected grace of being given that reminder by the person he least expected to give it. He went downstairs. He found Isabella in the kitchen. She was alone, early morning staff, not yet in making coffee, with the efficiency of someone who has learned the rhythms of a large kitchen and moves through them without thinking. She heard him come in and looked up. He said, "Can I have a cup of that?" She said, "It's your kitchen." "That's not an answer to the question," he said. She almost smiled. She poured a second cup and set it on the counter, and he picked it up, and they stood in the quiet of the early morning kitchen and drank coffee. The way 2 people do when they have been through something significant together and have arrived finally at the part where it's quiet. After a moment, he said, "I want to ask you something." "Okay," she said. "Your long-term plan," he said. "What is it? Not the job, not the immediate. What do you actually want? She looked at him. Why? She said. Because you're one of the most capable people I've had in this house, he said. And I don't mean capable at housekeeping, though you're excellent at that. I mean capable at seeing. At reading a situation and knowing what it requires. At making difficult decisions quickly and correctly. He paused. That's a rare thing. I'd like to know if you have a plan for it. Isabella looked at her coffee. She said, I was thinking about going back to school, finishing what I started. What were you studying? Business administration, she said. I know, not the most interesting answer. It's a very interesting answer, he said. What kind of business? She looked at him. Are you offering me something? I'm asking you a question, he said. What kind of business? A pause. Operations, she said. I'm good at seeing how things work and where they're breaking and what would fix them. I've always been good at that. She paused again. I just never had the resources to do anything with it. Damien said, I have a foundation. A legitimate one, Educational Grants Professional Development Workforce Training. It funds continuing education for people who had to stop for financial reasons. Isabella was still. I'm not offering you charity, he said. I'm offering you a grant application. Same process as anyone else. Your record speaks for itself. You'd get it on merit. She looked at him for a long time. She said, You'd have to recuse yourself from the decision. Obviously, he said. And I'd want to keep working here until the semester starts. I'd want to earn the rest of what I need on my own. That's your call, he said. And my brother. Your brother's arrangement with me is between him and me, Damien said. It doesn't connect to this. She studied him. She said, Why are you doing this? He looked at her. He said, Because 3 weeks ago you sat on a laundry room floor talking to your brother about Providence and scholarships and the decision you had to make at 20 years old. And I think the decision you had to make at 20 shouldn't be the thing that defines the ceiling. She stared at him. How do you know about the laundry room floor? She said. He said, I don't monitor your calls, Isabella, but Marcus mentioned that you'd called your brother late that night, and I drew a conclusion. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're more complicated than you look. So are you, he said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the morning was just starting to come, that particular gray light before the sun commits, when everything is still possible and nothing has been decided yet. She said, I'll think about the grant. That's all I'm asking, he said. He finished his coffee. He set the cup on the counter. He said, Isabella. Yes. My mother told me what you said to her, at the table, about not knowing what the boundaries were anymore. She waited, going slightly still. You were right to ask, he said. And I want to give you a real answer. He paused. The boundaries are yours. I'm not going to push against them. I'm not going to blur them in ways that make your position here complicated. What happened these past 3 weeks, what you did, has changed things in this family. In me. But that doesn't mean I have a right to change things in your life without your consent. He looked at her directly. You understand what I'm saying? Yes, she said. Good, he said. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He said without turning, because some things are easier said to the air. For what it's worth, when I watched you come out of that door with the thermos, I hadn't seen anything that real in a very long time. He walked out. Isabella Cruz stood in the kitchen with her coffee and the early morning light and the quiet of a house that had been a few weeks ago. A tightly sealed container of performed lives, and was now finally and irrevocably something else. She stood there for a while. Then she picked up her phone and opened the Romano Foundation's website and looked at the grant application page, which she had found 3 days ago, and looked at twice and closed both times because she wasn't sure she was ready. She was still not entirely sure she was ready, but she opened it. She started reading. 4 months later, Antonio and Sofia Romano came to the Westchester house for Sunday dinner. Not in disguise, not in worn coats. In their own clothes, in their own car, through the front gate, in the ordinary way of a family coming to eat a meal together. The house was different. Not structurally. The same rooms, the same stone, the same iron gate, with the same view from the service road where everything had begun. but different in the way that houses are different, when the people inside them are no longer performing for each other, when the warmth is real rather than expensive. When the Sunday dinner is a Sunday dinner and not a management of appearances. Isabella was not at the dinner table. She was 3 weeks into her first semester at Columbia, which she had started in September on a Romano Foundation grant that she had received on merit, the committee's word, not Damien's, and which she had accepted after her brother told her in his characteristic way that refusing it out of pride was the same as refusing a meal because the plate was too nice. She came by on Sunday afternoon before the family arrived to drop off something she had baked, a bread pudding. Sophia's favorite, which she had learned from watching the kitchen staff and adapted to something slightly different and considerably better. She set it on the kitchen counter. She was putting on her coat to leave when Damien came in. He looked at the bread pudding. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "How's school?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Good. Both." "Both is right," he said. She pulled on her coat. He said, "Stay for dinner." She looked at him. "Your parents want you here," he said. "My mother called me this morning and mentioned she hoped you'd be here. She was not subtle about it." Isabella looked at the door. She looked at the kitchen she had worked in for months, the kitchen that had been the center of everything, the kitchen where it had all become real. She said, "I have reading to do tonight." "You can do it after dinner," he said. A pause. "It's a lot of reading," she said. "Isabella," he said. And the way he said it, direct, warm, without any of the management or the calculation or the careful positioning that had characterized everything in this house before, was the way you say someone's name when you mean it. When the name itself is the thing you want to say. She looked at him. He looked at her. She took off her coat. "Fine," she said. "But I'm not doing dishes. I did dishes in this kitchen for 4 months." "I'll do the dishes," he said. She almost laughed. "You have never done a dish in this house," she said. "Tonight I will," he said. "I'm expanding my skill set." And Isabella Cruz, who had walked out of a kitchen door 3 months ago with a thermos and a decision that cost her nothing and changed everything, sat down at the table where Sophia Romano would sit in a house that had learned finally to be warm and waited for a family to arrive that was already in the ways that mattered hers. Antonio and Sophia arrived at 6. Sophia walked into the kitchen and saw Isabella at the table and stopped and put both hands on the young woman's face. The way she had held Damien's face when he was small, the way she held the faces of people she had decided to love completely. She said, "You stayed." "I stayed," Isabella said. Sophia sat down next to her. Antonio came in behind her and looked at the bread pudding and looked at Isabella and looked at his son standing at the kitchen counter, and he said, "Are you going to stand there all evening, or are you going to sit with your family?" Damien sat down, and the dinner was real. The conversation was real. The laughter was real. The bread pudding was, according to Sophia, the best thing she had eaten since Christmas. The arguments about small things. Antonio's opinion about the best route from Brooklyn. Sophia's correction of Antonio's opinion. Damien's complete refusal to take sides were the arguments of a real family in a real room at a real table. And Isabella was there, not as a symbol, not as a lesson, not as the woman who had changed everything by doing something small and true. As herself. As a person who had walked into this house with nothing but her own character, and had, without trying, without strategy, without any awareness of what it would cost or what it would change, revealed to a family that had forgotten what warmth felt like, what it felt like. After dinner, Damien did the dishes. Isabella stood next to him with a towel and dried what he washed, and they did not talk about anything significant. They talked about her operations professor, who had strong opinions about supply chain management and expressed them at volume, and about Marco, who had gotten a new job in Providence and had called Isabella 3 times in the last week to describe his commute in unnecessary detail, and about Antonio's rude opinions, which Isabella had found surprisingly defensible. They talked the way people talk when the hard part is over, and what remains is the life. At 8:30, Isabella put on her coat. She said goodnight to Sophia, who held her hands for a moment, and said something in Italian that Damien later told her meant roughly, "You are the right thing." She said good night to Antonio, who shook her hand with both of his and said, "Thank you for everything you did." She said, "I just brought them coffee." Antonio shook his head. "No," he said. "You did something much harder than that. You stayed yourself in a house that was trying very hard to make everyone in it into something else." He paused. "That's not a small thing." She looked at him. She thought about what Marco had said on the laundry room floor call that Damien had somehow intuited without hearing. "You just kept being exactly who you are." She thought about Providence and her mother, and the 2 jobs, and the partial scholarship, and the 2 years of college, and the decision she had made at 20, that had felt at the time like a door closing. She thought about a thermos, and a concrete barrier, and a cold morning, and 2 strangers who had turned out to be the most important people she had never met. She nodded to Antonio. She walked to the door. Damien walked her out. They stood at the front door, and the night was cold, the way that November nights are cold, clean and direct without ambiguity. She said, "Thank you for dinner." He said, "Thank you for the bread pudding." She said, "Sophia's easy to cook for. She responds to everything." "She does," he said. "She always has." A pause. She said, "Damien." He looked at her. "Whatever this is," she said with the clarity that was the most consistent thing about her, the clarity that had been there in the cold and in the kitchen and in the linen room, and at every point between, "I want it to be real, not grateful, not obligated, real." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "So do I." She said, "Okay." She walked to her car. She drove away. He stood at the door until her taillights disappeared at the gate. Then he went back inside to the kitchen, where his parents were finishing the last of the bread pudding and arguing about whether it needed more bourbon in the sauce, and he sat down, and he was home. The gate closed behind her. The same gate where 2 elderly strangers had once stood in the cold, asking for nothing more than water and a place to rest. The gate that a young woman with a thermos had walked through, not knowing she was walking toward anything at all, not knowing that the simplest, most unguarded act of her life would become the axis around which an empire would turn and a family would remember after years of forgetting what it meant to be one. Some people change the world with power. Some people change it with money. Some people change it with strategy and intelligence and the long, careful, ruthless game of influence. And some people change it by walking out a door in the cold with something warm and offering it to a stranger simply because the stranger was cold and the warm thing was there. That is the rarest kind of power. The kind that doesn't know its power at all. The kind that was, is, and will always be the only force strong enough to walk into the most fortified house in the world and change everything inside it, not by force, not by cunning, but by the simple, ancient, irresistible act of being exactly, completely, and without a